Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Jason and I are finally back after being many weeks now. I'm trying to think. We were just talking before we came on air, Jason. I think it's been like 7, 8 weeks, something pretty long now where one, both, or the other of us have been out and about on the road. You just literally red-eyed back in to get back to Texas. Jason there's fresh tire tracks out in his driveway, I believe, right now from the Uber driver dropping you off. I'm back home in Colorado. Before we jump into today, we like to encourage you to give a shout out where you may be tuning in from. We've got a world map we're going to check in on. As mentioned, Jason's in Texas. I am in Colorado. We have production capabilities in Georgia in the United States, and we've also got great production assistance coming out of Europe in Romania. Encourage everyone to say hi. Ask any questions or make any comments too along the way, but always love to see where people might be tuning in from. No, it's been a little while. We were also mentioning, Jason, what's interesting now, almost 2.5 years into doing this stream, we will get 3 times or more as many viewers in the next week that watch a replay of this as opposed to watching it live, meaning every stream gets around 2,000 to 2,500 or more views every single time we go out, which oftentimes can be weekly. So shout out to everyone for that. Thank you.
Yeah, as long as we're on that topic, Dave, I think we do actually have a SurveyMonkey link. We're trying to understand a little bit more around, when are folks watching the Monday stream and the Friday stream, and what do you like? And in fact, there's a box in there where you can put in what would you like to hear more about? Is it features? Is it research? Is it market trends? So we'll try to get the SurveyMonkey link up into that stream. We'd love to hear your feedback on that as well.
Yep. Thank you. And what we thought we would do is revisit, I don't want to say one of our favorite topics because the topic is not favorable. However, cyber and ransomware is a topic that is arguably inescapable, not going away. Now, having had the pleasure of taking our ransomware research report that kicked off at our Las Vegas Veeam in May, we've been able now to take that to live events in a multitude of different countries. I presented in Sydney, Australia, Bogota, Colombia, Mexico City, Mexico. We've prepared special versions of that for our colleagues to deliver in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to Sao Paulo, Brazil, to London, England. Just yesterday was in Germany, and the list goes on. I'm sure I'm leaving out many countries, but the point being, we've learned some interesting things about some of the variations in the different geographies, but also, Jason, more details on the actual data itself. The more you live with the data, the more you learn from it.
Yeah. Now, you listed a lot of really, really fun places to go. I just got back from Charlotte, North Carolina, which doesn't sound quite as fancy as some of the places that you've been recently. But I had a dinner with a room full of CISOs, and we were talking more about this. This concept. You can't not talk about this on any data protection conversation in 2022, especially as organizations are leaning into 23 planning along the way. But we took a little bit of a different angle last night as far as how we describe ransomware. So let me go ahead and bring up the first slide. And what we started to talk about is there does seem to be a natural convergence in ways that we haven't seen before between the folks that think about cyber, who usually were always on one floor and no one ever really knew who they were or what they did other than manage the firewall, right? And then there's those backup admins, right? They're in the basement swapping the tapes kind of thing, is the two extremes. And then there's those folks that do BCDR. And no one really knows who was in that group. But there seems to be more of a natural understanding that those things kind of line up together. And so when we started the conversation last night over dinner, we talked about, okay, let's talk about the regular disasters, right? Because as much as we want to talk about ransomware, and certainly there's some technology vendors that are out there today that they just want to ignore all the other bad things that can happen in IT, and all they want to talk about is cybersecurity and ransomware. And I think that's over rotation, Dave, because when you think about real disasters, let's take the basics, because fire still happens, flood still happens, hurricanes still happen, right? And when you do that, there's kind of 3 core questions that you always want to ask yourself. First, are you assured that you actually can recover your data, right? So not just did the log work or not, but can you actually recover that workload? The second is, okay, and anytime we talk about a disaster, one of the stipulations of that is scale, right? I'm not recovering a server. At a minimum, I'm covering a rack or a room or a building, right? So whatever processes I have one workload at a time, how do I conjoin those together and shrink the time in between? And then the third one is, let's assume that if you're dealing with flood, your servers are underwater, so you don't get to use that original metal because that metal is dripping, right? So we need new metal, right? Or if you're suffering from fire, that metal is crispy, or underground or stolen, right? So for all those cases, you should be planning for alternative infrastructure, and maybe that's a secondary data center, maybe that's cloudy, right? But you should be planning for a recovery at scale someplace other than where the original environment came from. And so this is the stipulations for what any disaster looks like. When we take that conversation and add ransomware into the conversation, you could say it looks like any other disaster, except there's kind of a detour that happens when we go through this. So let me kind of break this out. And then, Dave, I'd love to kind of hear your feedback on this, because we still need to know, can I recover my workloads? We still need to think about doing this all at scale. We still need to think about using alternative infrastructure, but you kind of take this detour where first you have to ask yourself a few other questions. You have to ask, how much of your data was affected? Do you have any survivable copies left? And are they clean? Once you've answered those three questions, then we go right back to DR 101 and start actually executing that across the path. So this is kind of a different way to think about ransomware is a disaster. Dave, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I like how you broke that out, because we've been saying that Veeam ransomware is a disaster now for quite some time. And I heard, one other longtime industry veteran who has a great podcast, actually several podcasts, say, ransomware and a typical disaster recovery scenario are different. And the thesis there, I think, is what you alluded to and captured nicely in the orange little blocks here that you inserted, which is there are additional workflows. But I think that's true of any other disaster. So, shout out to the people in Jalisco, Mexico, as well as obviously Puerto Rico. We mentioned, multiple different things can still happen. Well, Monday, that Jalisco region got hit by earthquake. Now they're under tsunami warning. They've obviously had infrastructure breakage that's happened in that time frame. We know people without power, without even water and other kinds of capabilities outside of the data center in the Puerto Rico area and other areas of that overall region of the Caribbean. So to your point, these things still happen, meaning disasters. But when you get into a ransomware event, much of the response really still is the same. Because if you think about the end game, it is still get the business up and going. What you've highlighted here that I like are here are some potentially unique considerations that you've got from a cyber event or a ransomware event that need to be inserted into that workflow. But I'll just double back that I think the notion that ransomware is a disaster still works in my mind, because every kind of disaster, whether it's a natural weather event, a man-made concern that's not cyber related, or anything else that you can imagine, it all comes down to trying to execute a playbook and adapt to what's going to be required to get up and running.
Yeah, playbook, I think, is a great way to think about it, right? So you probably have that regular playbook that says, okay, I've got to recover all my workloads at scale to alternative infrastructure, the three green boxes. And that playbook mostly works across every major normal disaster. And then it's almost like in between steps 2 and 3, it says, see Appendix A if this was a cyber event, right? And then we go and look at the orange chapters in there as well. One of the things that came up during the conversation last night, and maybe that'll be the way for us to queue up to the kind of the data points that follow for this, is when you look at servers that have, say, had flood, right, or a tsunami or anything that's water-based, you know immediately which servers are okay, right, the dry ones. And then it's the non-dry servers. Those are the ones we have to immediately start jumping into action and start recovering from. Same with fire, same with earthquake. The problem is that you don't know. in ransomware, right? So you don't know which ones have, you can tell which ones are encrypted, but you don't know which ones already still have infection and the encryption hasn't triggered yet. So doing it, you actually have to do diligence on the entire infrastructure, irregardless of which ones might already be encrypted or not, which ones might be dripping or crispy. Or not along the way. David, you want to hear? Do you want to? We want to hit the map first and make sure that we have anything covered there, or shall we jump right into our first data point for today?
Yeah, I think the map is coming up soon. I just want to double down on something you mentioned because what you're essentially highlighting is, yet again, what are a couple other unique variations on ransomware compared to another disaster. As you were describing that, the one thought that comes to my mind is a unique thing about ransomware or some sort of cyber event is you may want to have the ability to preserve what was the initial state of the
Yes.
data and your infrastructure so that you can do some kinds of forensic analysis on that. So potentially, if there is cyber insurance or a cyber claim involved, they may want to be able to do some inspection. So that feeds back to your earliest point, I believe, which was you may not have the infrastructure or the metal to be able to recover to. You've got to go recover somewhere else. The variant here, if I tie those threads together, is maybe technically you have equipment that's available to you, but you can't step on that. You can't
Yes.
restore over that because you need to preserve the current state as it was in production so that it can be inspected. Else, you could risk, of course, not understanding the extent of the damage, but you could risk not getting your payout.
And sometimes, by the way, that's not your choice, right?
Yes.
So certainly if there are servers that are wholly encrypted, it's like, hey, I'll just wipe all the drives, I'll start over again. Well, depending on the industry that you're in, depending on the kind of data that might have been affected, you might come in Monday morning and say, okay, it's time to do the DR plan. And what you find is yellow tape
Mhm.
around those server racks, and someone from FBI, SEC, one of the other institutions is there saying, no, no, you don't get to touch this yet because until we can figure out what they might have seen or not seen, touched or not touched, we need this pristine, right? So
Yes.
sometimes it's not even your choice. In other cases, you really ought to leave it alone and go to someplace else because how are you going to know what the breadth of effect or impact is if you can't refer back to, okay, this is what it was before I restarted it. In the old days, Dave, back when you and I had a little less gray hair, right? We saw those times when your DR site of choice was some nondescript warehouse, and you made a phone call on the bat phone, and they started restoring your tapes for you, right? And then there was times when we said, your DR plan was you had pre-negotiated with a hardware vendor. Hey, if I call you, you're going to ship a whole bunch of servers to some other location, and it'll be there before I need it, right? 2022, neither of those is plan A anymore, right? So for many organizations, cloud is actually the biggest challenge that we've got, or the biggest opportunity.
Yeah, I want to go jump to the map, but I also want to come back to a couple of the points you made there because, as always, there's a lot to unpack here. But let's hit the world map right now.
There we
Obviously,
go.
Jason, we see a big piece of green showing up to our neighbors to the north of us, Canada. So thank you for that. We've got some additional United States coming in, states that is of Ohio. We've got another colleague close to you, Jason, in Dallas, Texas.
Nice.
Wisconsin, which is a little bit new for us, I believe, Jason. Correct me if I'm wrong, but haven't seen Wisconsin in some time. Alabama, Florida, Kansas, Michigan, and of course, Mexico. Hey, shout out to everyone there. Hope you're safe. It actually turns out both the Pacific and the Atlantic coasts are going through some weather, some more extreme than others, but hope
Uh,
everyone's doing well down there. If we look across the way, we see Spain, Germany, Poland, Denmark. And then also we look out and we see Saudi Arabia, Zambia, Jordan, and then India, of course. So shout out to all of those for tuning in. Thank you very much.
fantastic.
Keep your entries coming where you may be tuning in from. Great stuff. We always love to see that. So, Jason, I think I'm repeating myself because I think I shared this story, I don't know, several months ago. on one of our live streams, but I think it's applicable here too. Because what you were mentioning is that notion of you could have yellow tape streamed across
Right.
your infrastructure, meaning authorities have, or maybe the insurance actuator investigator has said, you can't touch this equipment. It reminds me of a story when I was an industry analyst when a major global movie studio, we'll call it, they were actually testing, thankfully, this was a test environment, but they were testing co-located data in the cloud for some of their older movies because from time to time, like every literally a couple decades, they re-release some of these
Oh, right.
movies as a special edition, say on a DVD or some other format with some expanded features, perhaps. So if you're going to do that, you need to make sure you can hang on to that data to monetize it far into the future. So as a tertiary, meaning a third level of protection, they were going to try to save some money and then go out to a co-located cloud environment. During testing of that, they found out they couldn't get to one of their sort of masterpiece collections. And further investigation, what they found out is their data was commingled with someone else's data, where the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation came in with a search warrant and yanked the drives. Didn't matter that a lot of other people, not just this movie studio, I'm sure there were other businesses affected. That was not of interest from a legal perspective. What
Right.
did happen was I'm authorized to take this infrastructure and I am removing these drives and taking it back to a forensic facility.
Wow.
So in
Wow.
some regards, you could call that cyber. It's a different variation on that, but it feeds into your point that you may not have production infrastructure at the ready.
Yeah, so one of the other things was really great about the CISO dinner that I was at last night was they talked about how and these were all very large institutions, and so cyber insurance was a big part of their deal. And think about like just regular insurance, right? So I can't go get my car fixed after it's been dinged up until
Right.
somebody from my insurance carrier comes and they need to take pictures. What's it look like now? Okay, now you can go ahead and start. And turns out that example works just the same for some of the cyber insurance policies that are there. Also, the cyber insurance policy holder wants to know, where what all was infected and what was impacted. And so, because many of their insurance claims aren't around downtime, they're about replacement. They're okay with yellow taping some of those boxes. So it's in other cases, the negotiator, almost everyone at the table said, we have pre-negotiated on retainer a negotiator because the negotiator actually will call the bad actors directly and say, hey, it's me again. Let's do this and go from there. And again, there's a requirement to sequester the original data. So lots of horror stories that I'd never heard before last night, all of them with that same punchline.
Well, what I think is interesting on that, a point that I believe you've raised before, is that the thing about cyber is recovery begins on someone else's timetable typically.
Yeah.
And so you've highlighted but one point there where literally the people or agency that you've employed, meaning the negotiator, ostensibly they're there to reduce costs. That's also probably elongating the time frame as well. So when we think of recovery time objectives, it's out of your control because maybe there's a negotiator involved. Maybe that takes a few days or however long. Then maybe you get the key, but you don't know exactly when. That's on obviously the bad actor's time frame. And then it comes back to your lap. When can you begin to actually begin the start on the restoration experience? So when we were used to thinking of RTO in the data center, we kind of like to think that it's all within our control. But here's a great example of where it's not.
Yeah, and bring that diagram back up again because we keep thinking about this as ransomware as simply a different kind of handling of any other kind of traditional disaster, right? So if I was just dealing with fire or flood, I get the call. Back 20 years ago, I used to have a yellow waterproof bag in the back of my trunk. I had a phone; they could always get a hold of me. Someone called, and it's like, okay, I can be there in 90 minutes, and we will start the recovery exercise. Right? You don't get to do that here because first it gets negotiated, then you may or may not get the key, then you have to allow for secondary infrastructure or get it on demand, and law enforcement says, okay, now you're allowed, and then you're off to the races. And so don't underestimate what that can look like. let's build on that for a second. Let's talk about paying versus paying for the ransom versus, let's say, did you actually recover? And Dave, this is an area that you and I have spent a lot of time on. I think it's actually one of my probably most powerful findings from this particular research. If we were kind of boiled down, this is lessons learned from 1,000 organizations, all of whom suffered at least one successful cyber event in 2021. Successful meaning the bad actor got in, right? Not whether or not they were able to survive or not. The URL for this, if you haven't already downloaded the report, go to VEE.am/RW22. VEE.am/RW22. So this is, I think, one of our most favorites. So if we talk about those folks that said, I'm not going to pay the ransom, right? Our board says we will not pay the ransom. I was talking with a really large healthcare company, Fortune 100, last night at dinner, and they said, the board originally had this stance, and they said, we will not pay the ransom. The problem is that when most organizations say they're not going to pay the ransom, they're just thinking downtime and costs, and it's IT and it's in dollars. Healthcare provider can't get to data. I've got patients on an operating table. I don't know where they are in the process. I can't get to the x-rays. I don't know what the drug counts are. I can't pay for it. All those things that come into fray. All of a sudden you have quality of life issues. Certainly you can make similar cases for police and those kind of things. But Dave, take a look at the data here when organizations were first asked, did they pay? And as much as everyone wants to say, no, don't give them what they want, 76%, 3 out of 4 organizations did actually pay the ransom. Now, interestingly enough, 1 out of 3 of those that paid still couldn't restore. That just scares the bejeebies out of me.
That's really the definition of the double whammy, meaning well, maybe it's a triple whammy. You got it infected, you decided to pay, and then you did not get the decryption key. You did not get the data for whatever reason. So it is, though, interesting to your point. 3 out of 4, at least of this sample size of 1,000, and this is industry-wide, not Veeam customers, and it's from multiple different countries, so it's not just one region or one industry vertical. 3 out of 4 elected to pay the ransom. I guess if you could say if there's any good news in that, at least, and 2 out of 4 got everything back. But unfortunately, these are poor odds in terms of 1 out of 3 are going to have a high failure rate, approximately.
Right.
3 out of 4 paying the ransom. Well, that only obviously perpetuates the bad actors to say the business that you're in is indeed profitable. Keep going after this. Keep advancing your attacks.
Yeah, think about that schoolyard bully that steals your lunch money, right? So if after you've paid once, the next time that the bully is hungry, he's going to come and ask you for money again. You just became an ATM to some 7th grader, right, along that way. Now, this is for the 3 out of 4 organizations, 76% that actually did pay out of this. There is some good news that kind of comes out of this. If we look at the rest of that diagram, you'll see that 19%, only 1 out of 5 organizations said, no, we didn't pay, we just restored. And of course, that's why Veeam talks about this. That's why every backup and storage technology is talking about ransomware, because your goal in life should be to be in that green wedge in the upper left-hand corner. Can I get an amen?
Yeah, absolutely. This, unfortunately, it's the second largest number, meaning 19%, but that is absolutely what Veeam's in the business of trying to do, is maximize that. You can get your data. You don't have to pay your ransom. You're not on anyone else's time schedule. You are not really essentially out of business potentially, or at least have business operations that are down. So unfortunately, that's obviously way too low, 19%. Jason, the other one that I always harp on is the next, or the lowest number, which is, I'm sorry, if we could go back one really quickly, because it was interesting on the 5%. It was a very small number, but 5% said there was no ransom asked for. And I always use the phrase, well, then that's essentially arson, yet
Right.
that's not extortion. What's interesting now, looking at global variations, is that because we've got so much data, we can look to see what's different in different regions. In Mexico City, or Mexico, where I was just a couple weeks ago, that number was actually 9%.
Wow.
So almost double. So now all of a sudden we go from 1 out of 20 organizations, and it was a room of like 600 people or something like that. Plus, it was being
Sure.
live streamed all over Mexico and in nearby other Spanish speaking countries. So that 1 out of 20, which would have been many, many people, like dozens and dozens of people that were in the room, went to
Right.
1 out of 10 when we moved from global average to local regional average.
That's amazing. But I mean, that's admittedly one of the fun parts about all the research that Veeam does, right? So,
Yes.
do you need to have 1,000 organizations to really get a good answer on some of these things like ransomware? No. But this particular set of data actually had, let's see, we had 200 CISOs. 200 backup ops, so the folks that are responsible for remediation, 200 IT operations generalists, so you can figure out, what do they think because they're the ones who get the first call, and then 400 security professionals, those closest to both prevention and remediation. So having 5 different personas was actually part of the design goals of this project. Our largest research report ever had 3,400 responses. So I think we had like 270 just for Mexico itself. And then for our friends, if you keep moving south, Brazil had its own cut, and Argentina had its own cut, and Colombia had its own cut. And so that's why we do these projects at such scales, to understand the nuances in each of these markets.
Yeah, I do want to give a shout out. We had someone join from France as well, so do want to give a shout out to them. More European representation. Thank you very much for that. Jason, as we begin to wind down, I know you want to revisit one of the opening slide essentially. Let's do that.
So what you're looking at on the top is, we've talked for the whole session around looking, the green boxes is every disaster that you have to think about, right? Can you recover workload by workload? What can you do at scale? And then, oh, by the way, plan for secondary infrastructure. We talked about how you're going to take a detour on some of that when it comes to ransomware, and think about, how pervasive was the attack? Do you have survivable repositories? Do you know that the data in those repositories is clean? Right, along that way. Just, in the spirit of being a good Veeamer, there's a different way to look at this, and that is, how Veeam describes it. And we think about it as secure backups really being that last line of defense. And so from a backup set of initiatives, you see things like what we do in trust and immutability, how we verify the backups are recoverable, how we embrace not just the 3-2-1 rule, that's the industry rule, but we've added another one and another zero. So for us, it's a 3-2-1-1-0 rule. That's on the backup side of the house. On the recovery side, we pioneered instant recovery, and so that's going to lean right into the best practice. The idea of secure restore, we talked about that as far as restoring clean data. And then certainly the hero scenario here, what makes all of this really work, is what we do in orchestration for workflows and scripts and documentation and automated verification. So while we tend to focus on the broad goal, the top of the screen, Veeam actually has an answer for each and every one of these and beyond. So if you haven't checked that out, we do hope that you will.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And I believe we've got the survey link that we referenced. Oh, I'm sorry. We also had Henrik from Denmark. So love to give you a shout out,
Hey,
Henrik,
Henrik.
and thank you so much for joining all the way from Denmark. Jason and I are happy to visit sometime soon. We can have this conversation at a cafe sometime in person. So we've got a survey link that you see at the bottom, veeam.am/live survey. We just have a short questionnaire just to see how, when you like to consume these. We love doing them, Jason, myself, and our production team, our global production team. But I'd love to give any input that you've got and be able to factor that in going forward. As always, thank you so much for joining. Jason, great to be back.
Too.
Stay safe, stay positive, everyone. We'll see you on the next live stream.